The National Mastitis Council. It's an international association of 1,000 members whose scope reaches far beyond mastitis into all aspects of milk quality, udder health, and animal well-being. Today it's all about quality and wholesomeness of dairy foods. And for more than a half-century, NMC has addressed these issues and brought global dairy issues to the forefront. We are a non-profit organization with the objective to help deliver high-quality, healthy dairy products to consumers everywhere. Our membership is veterinarians, dairy producers, university and independent researchers, extension specialists, industry suppliers, dairy plant field staff, regulatory officials, and students. This diversity is unmatched within any dairy education and information group in the world.
As a dairy farmer today, it's so much more than just milking cows. An organization like National Mastitis Council gives us the tools to produce the quality milk necessary to meet high demands of our consumers today. The educational materials and the annual meeting each year delivers the best value to me as a member.
And that's what the NMC is all about. The educational materials on udder health, milking management, and milk quality are second to none. And when combined with attendance at either the annual meeting or summer regional conference, members are provided with a wealth of opportunities to advance their knowledge of dairy production.
It's an organization that's really, well worth being a member. It's different from others in that I feel like when you go to a conference, there's so many different people there. It's not just researchers and people that are doing research data, but it's people that are actually in the field and seeing things, producers and industry professionals, and also then the researchers. And when you get all those people together in one conversation, that makes that conversation and that whole conference so much worthwhile.
The international aspect of NMC membership is growing every year. Conferences on several continents give all members an opportunity to learn about mastitis control and milk quality with experts around the world.
These international meetings are invaluable to me. The chance to interact with leading researchers around the globe represents some of my best learning opportunities as an NMC member and for my company. Our membership reaches more than 40 countries. By growing around the world, we bring more value and knowledge to the dairy industry.
One outstanding membership benefit is networking. NMC's diverse and global membership provides many networking opportunities, and equally important are the lifetime friendships that make NMC an extended family for its members.
There's no better way to learn about controlling mastitis and looking to achieve milk quality than attending an NMC meeting. I've been a member for decades and also served on the board of directors. Now, the educational and the information gathering value goes without saying, but the chance to network with colleagues and peers and others at the grassroots level can't be overemphasized. Local vets and dairy producers make every meeting priceless for me.
Having safe, wholesome dairy products and increasing milk production efficiency while preventing mastitis requires the team effort that only NMC can provide for you. Someone once said that everything gets better with milk. Join NMC today to taste the best we have to offer.
My name's Dave Kelton, and I have the privilege of serving as the Vice President of NMC this past year, and in that role as the Program Chair for this, our 57th annual meeting of the National Mastitis Council. It's my privilege to welcome you all here to our beautiful facility in Tucson, Arizona, and I'm really excited about the program that we've managed to put together for you over the next couple of days. I want to start by acknowledging all the hard work that went in behind the scenes to put a program like this together. I get to stand up here and be the figurehead, but had a tremendous program committee. They're listed on page 9 of your program. In addition to those folks who gave a lot of time and energy and thought to the program, we also have Gardner and Gardner who do a lot of the background and all the facility management and the preparation, and particularly Jody Sattler for harassing the speakers, getting the proceedings together, the presentations in, and so on. And last but certainly not least, all the speakers who have agreed to come and participate in this program. I think we've got a fantastic program for you, and I hope you'll agree with me once you've seen it. The theme for this meeting is the 5-point plan revisited, and the 5-point mastitis control program. The notion has been around for many, many years, and in fact Eric Hillerton will give us a little bit of the historical perspective on that, but it's really the foundation of many of the things that we do in maintaining and promoting udder health and milk quality. It has led to the development of the 10-point NMC mastitis control program, and also has spun off some other versions. Most recently, Tom Hemling published an interesting article in the M2 magazine, and again, as NMC members, you all have access to the M2 magazine. I'll remind you about that, on the 7-point mastitis control program. So again, it's been the foundation of many of the things that we do. This morning, we're going to start the program with a bit of an overview and look at it from a historical perspective, some of the current issues and even future issues that I think drive us to revisit some of the core elements of that program and see how we need to tweak them and make sure that they still remain relevant. This afternoon, we're going to do a number of things. We're going to have a split session. On the one hand, we'll have research and development summaries, and in the other half of the room, what we're going to do is celebrate some of what dairy producers have been able to accomplish in a consistent manner in producing high-quality milk. A little bit about the National Dairy Quality Awards program, what we've learned from that program, and we're going to finish the afternoon with a panel of 3 outstanding dairy producers to learn a little bit about what their thoughts and their activities are around effectively and continuously producing high-quality milk. Tomorrow we'll move to a broader focus on some of the issues around the 5-point plan, and then in the afternoon we'll finish with our featured symposium, which will delve a little bit more deeply into the issue of selective dry cow therapy. Are we ready for that or not? And look at it in a bit of a provocative manner, I hope, and also get some shared experiences from around the world in jurisdictions where they've adopted a selective dry cow therapy program. So in a nutshell, that's the program. I hope that you'll enjoy it. One of the things I'll remind you is that we do have an NMC app that you can download, and as part of that app is the entire program, the facility map, all the schedules, and so on. And there is an opportunity to evaluate the program as you go directly through the app, or you can wait for the written evaluations at the end, but we do value your feedback. So I thank you in advance for doing that for us. At this point, I'm going to turn the program over to Mario Lopez. Mario has been our president for the current year, and he's going to share with you some of the exciting things that NMC has been involved in these, what was actually quite a short 12 months, but it's been a busy 12 months. Mario.
Good morning, everyone. So my name is Mario Lopez, and I am the 2017 National Mastitis Council President, at least for the next day or so. We converge here for our 57th annual NMC meeting, and we have the opportunity to meet once again with friends, with colleagues, with new friends. And I would just say take the opportunity to look at the people around you, welcome them, especially if they're new members. We, of course, want to make sure they come back and see us again. We meet to listen, to learn, to interact, of course, and to participate actively in the topics that are of common interest to all of us. And we have hands-on activities that help us to improve our professional approach to the management of mastitis and the improvement of milk quality. And you can be assured that our organizing committee, of course, did a very good job in taking everything into account, that you do have a very solid program in that sense. So we have a good balance of topics in the general session and the short courses that are directly related to global dairy trends and interests. So there is clearly an abundance of data and information throughout the accessible printed and electronic channels, as you are well aware. This includes the social media. So these sources of information can easily confirm our existing belief systems, if that is what we desire. So this does not only include matters on politics, on religion, but also matters concerning views on the milk industry and how we perceive that in our daily lives. So while natural, political, and market factors, for example, the milk price, were the key drivers for effective dairy regions in the past, we should be aware that the new technologies, for example, big data and diagnostic tools, and social issues that include customer acceptance, are going to play a bigger role from now on. As an organization, we need to make sure we continue to acknowledge these drivers and work together to focus our efforts at understanding and communicating our viewpoints. Milk is a good source of nutrients for a growing population, and that is one of the reasons, of course, we meet here. We are generally interested in improving the milk quality. With our compounded knowledge, milk production and animal welfare, we should be able to effectively inform and educate not only the dairy producer, but all the people associated with the production and consumption of milk, and how they can trust that the end product has been harvested with the best known, and this is technically, sustainably, and socially responsible methods available today. That is the mission we have. As NMC members, I believe we should be proud to be ambassadors of an organization that actively promotes the production of nutritious and safe food for the consumer. Membership, like this one, is an organization of like-minded individuals. And this is important for the personal and professional development of each one of us. With more than 5 decades of history, the NMC is still a strong organization that brings together people from around the world. And I believe we have a representation of more than 40 countries, not necessarily all at this meeting, but we're very proud that the organization and the acknowledgement of NMC keeps growing year by year. We are an organization whose objectives is not only to meet once or twice a year, which is very nice, of course, but also have the working groups and members that actively and proactively engage in tackling those drivers that we previously mentioned. Our meeting programs, our updated publications, and the committee fact sheets that we produce are a clear indication of that commitment, and I thank you for that. We acknowledge and value the participation of our members in these volunteer-based activities, and want to thank you all for that, for these initiatives. It's also a very good opportunity that I take to invite the new and existing members of the NMC to take advantage of the many opportunities that are there for you to participate and become an active member of NMC. I am deeply humbled to be the 2017 NMC president. I am fortunate to say that we have a very strong and supportive board of directors group, as well as an association management firm. It really has made life easier, I can tell you that. Gardner & Gardner Communications has been a pivotal partner for NMC, and I'm very happy to see that the organization continues to grow. We have been able to work very well as a group and completed objectives for the year that we tasked back since last year. As an organization, financially, NMC is in a very good position, and we continue to find opportunities to provide value for our existing members. And like David mentioned, you as members have access to new sources of information, including the M-Square magazine. And I encourage you to really look into it. There's very interesting insights as to what is happening around the world. And it just opens up the opportunities to increase your network as well. We support educational experiences for new upcoming professionals in the area of mastitis and control of milk quality. And you will meet some of our NMC Scholars Program, the awardees, the people that have been awarded this. We recognize the dairy producers that understand the value of producing milk of the highest quality, and you will get to meet them and hear about their stories at the National Dairy Quality Awards program. And also, we honor NMC members who have sustained a significant contribution to mastitis control and milk quality. This is the NMC Award of Excellence. As an organization, we have also supported initiatives that take the NMC purpose to other countries outside the United States. This is a global organization, and our aim as an organization is to make sure that we try to meet that mission. We have conducted meetings in Belgium, China, and now in Canada in July. These types of initiatives and participation will only make NMC stronger in the years to come, and it really requires that we all participate in this. We are also very fortunate to count with the support of many sponsors, and I take this opportunity to really thank the sponsors for coming together to this organization. Without the sponsors, we cannot make this happen, so thank you very much. Their commitment to NMC over the years is greatly appreciated, so thank you again. The future is bright for NMC, I am sure of that. Together we can continue to be part of NMC and help sustain the mission to provide a forum of education and global exchange of information on milk quality, mastitis, and relevant research. Thank you for allowing the Board of Directors to represent your interests and initiatives. We look forward to the new challenges that we face as an organization and count on you to tackle them together. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mario. As you can tell from Mario's remarks, it's been a busy year, and Mario's done a tremendous job in leading us through this busy time. So at this point, we'll move to our first session of this conference, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the morning. For many in the room, and probably for most actually, he needs very little introduction. Eric Hillerton hails from Scotland and received his early education at the University of Edinburgh. He spent the first roughly half of his career in the United Kingdom and really developed quite a strong reputation as a leader in many areas, but particularly around issues of udder health and milk quality. And then in the latter half of his career, he moved clear around the world to New Zealand and had a prominent role with Dairy NZ, and again provided a lot of leadership both nationally and internationally in the area of udder health and milk quality. Most notably, Eric served as president of NMC in 2011, and it's my pleasure to invite Eric to come up and deliver our first presentation of this conference, and that is the 5-Point Mastitis Control Program, a Revisory tutorial. Eric.
Thank you, Dave. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the latest of my final talks. I'm really very privileged to be allowed to give this talk because I'm probably one of the very few people left who actually knew and was able to work with the majority of the people in this story. So the story is going back over 60 years. Now, I acknowledge my co-author here, James Booth, who you'll hear more about later. James was a very long-term member of NMC, came to here for 20 consecutive meetings or so. A few of you may have met him. Okay, in the purpose of today's talk, I've included a few words from Te Reo Maori, which is one of the languages of New Zealand, because it actually has a very sort of spiritual sense to the whole of Maoridom. And I included these words, and they're actually explained in the written version of the talk. Oh, by the way, there will not be a lot of connection between the written version and what I'm going to talk about today. That's for you to enjoy or read as you wish. It's very boring just to stand up here and tell you exactly what's written down. There are many more interesting things to this story. I'm going to talk about them than the actual historical record that's laid out. So this is about Ole Konga, which is the disciples, the scholars of mastitis and milk quality, need to know their whakapapa. That's the genealogy, the lineage of the backgrounds as to where they actually come from, to have sufficient mana, that's credibility, to do the job they want. Hopefully, most of the story of this upoko, which is this chapter in mastitis control, is captured here and will help the plan, the 5-point plan, to retain tapu, to remain sacrosanct. So that's the intention I have. Whether I can ever achieve it is something entirely different. Now, the contents of what I'm going to talk about today look long and complicated. Some of them will be very brief and some will be in more detail because, by and large, I actually found some of them actually quite boring. And you don't want me to stand up here and go through innumerable experiments and trials conducted 60 years ago, point by point, what was done, why, what they found out, who did it, where and what. You can read all of that if you really want. I'll take the high-level stuff out of that. The real story in all of this, however, is the bits about where, in fact, did Five-Point Plan actually come from, who was involved in it, and what actually is the story, and how have we been successful in selling it and getting people to engage in its adoption and use. And some very interesting facts came out when we started to delve into that, because nobody actually really knew. And I don't think we have the definitive answer yet, but I'm going to tell you what I believe it actually is. So we'll go through the strategy, who, what, where, turning research into practicality, a lot about communication and the timeline over the last 50-plus years, and about successful extension, and finish up with something about the lessons we can learn and what it might look like, not today, but tomorrow. Unfortunately, our good friend Larry Smith is not with us this year. This is a Larry Smith-type cartoon from New Zealand back in 1974-75. Remember, Larry was the person who said, if it's white and runs downhill, it's milk, when we were trying to get cell count limits lowered. Well, this is a New Zealand picture. The guy on the left is the milker. The guy on the right is the government advisor who's come in to have a consultation. And as he says, in New Zealand, you drink tea, not coffee. Milk in your tea, 1 lump or 2. That's what it was like in terms of milk quality and mastitis control in those days. No one was alone in doing things in the world. It wasn't just one particular group in the US or the UK or wherever. We had very noticeable contributions made by, for example, the people in Germany at Kiel. Lots of things they did exciting, very, very major leaders in cell counting. The Nordic countries took a different direction. They became very much used to a state veterinary service. That's how they manage things. The US, the more you look at it, the more different approaches you can actually find historically, as different states did different things and totally failed to agree at all points. And in the UK, the National Institute for Research in Dairying, where I was fortunate to work before it closed in 1985, NIRD, did lots of things. Their particular claim to fame might be in hygienic milking systems. Now, let's go back to 1956 and talk about the US system, where the different states had totally different opinions about mastitis and milk quality. Such that an ADSA symposium, Murphy laid down the law a little bit and said, hey guys, you've got to get your act together here. What actually is the story? What are we actually doing? And this is a very important starting paper you must all read. And you may have noticed we've now got an NMC recommended reading list. It's on the website. You can access it there. And the PDFs are actually there to make it easy for you. The starting point is to read this paper. Murphy lays out 8 principles you should actually follow. So start with that. It was a very great starting point. The next starting point is from NIRD, these guys. And this is a 1964 paper, again, an ADSA symposium, where Frank Dodd, who is at the top there, was on sabbatical at Cornell and was giving this paper. Now, Frank Dodd, this guy here, Frank had a long and illustrious career in mastitis control milking systems from 1944, I think, his first paper, until after he retired in 1985. So he's well known and should be revered in many areas. There's only one thing let down his career. I was one of his last hires. The guy below is a mystery to many, many people. That's Frank Neve. You may have seen the name. Frank was a mystery because Frank never gave a talk anywhere. I only know one talk he ever gave. But he was the most meticulous scientist you could get. And he was the person who created the whole of the early parts of teat assessment and teat conditioning. Frank actually, he let this system down as well. He was John Bramley's PhD supervisor, for those of you who know John Bramley, lately of Vermont University. Frank actually, unfortunately, had to retire in 1975 because he had throat cancer. and Bramley took on his job at that point. And the guy below is also another mystery, Roger Kingwell, who's the guy who did all the things behind it all. Roger is about 85 and I believe still happily retired, living in the south coast of England. So these are the characters that are involved in all of that, and most of you will never have seen this or their pictures. I just want to recognize their role. Now, in that 1964 paper, Dodd gave this a talk about where NIRD was thinking about what they'd been doing. They'd been working since 1955 on hygienic milking systems. And he came up with this diagram. The very first time this diagram was produced in mastitis, many of you will have seen it in many other places if you've done any reading. And the epidemiologists here will recognize it as a standard susceptibility, infection, recovery, or resistance picture. But nobody had put the words mastitis on it before. And Dodd never actually recognized it anywhere in 20, 30 years of writing as an SIR model, but that's what it actually is. And he probably got it when he was at Cornell, because I can't find any other place he got it. But recognize this, it's been fundamental and it remains so today. Excuse me, could we go back? Here we are. Yeah. We have actually here the uninfected or non-infected gland. We expose it to pathogens, it's got some susceptibility, we get an infection. And then it may go on to the clinical mastitis situation, we know. Some form of therapy, or naturally we may get a cure of some kind. This is also, I think, the only one where we clearly see the other way of curing the infection is either death by design or consequence. So fundamental, 1964, when it first appeared in the mastitis literature. And the two tenets that came out of the NIRD approach, what they were trying to achieve, was to say you could interfere in that diagram by, first of all, reducing the rate of new infections. However you do it, by preventing infections, lowering exposure, getting rid of infected herd mates, be much more hygienic in what you do, increase the cure rate, etc., etc. Or you reduce the length of an infection by curing it in lactation or dry period, or you remove it by culling the animal, the ultimate way of curing or removing an infection. If you're going to understand mastitis control, these are the two things we're trying to do and achieve. Has been for 60 years and will remain for the next 60 years. And so that's what the diagram actually looks like, where you actually target. You target by exposure to pathogens, or you target by actually reducing the duration of infection by some form of cure, elimination of infection. So epidemiologically what they're trying to do is saying the prevalence of infection, that is how many cows have we got infected at any particular time in the herd. And remember, in these days, it was 55% or more of cows in a herd were infected in one or more quarters. It was normal to be mastitic to some extent in a herd. And that is actually assessed by the total number of cows infected during the period and by the average proportion of the period that cows remained infected, and that's the duration part of infection and controlling it. So that what we actually get, this diagram that Dodd, etc. produced here, we can actually see, if you look at it, if we've got herd A here, and we have a long duration of infection, at the time here, we actually have 5 cows infected at this point, 5 cows infected at this point. So effectively, over the whole duration of this period, we've got 50% of cows infected. If we shorten the duration of infection, take cow 3 here, or even cow 6 here, shorten the duration of infection, maybe half the duration of infection, and then look at the time points, we've half the number of cows infected, 25% of cows infected. So we've reduced the prevalence of infection by reducing the duration of infection by effective treatment. So the two tenets of mastitis control always have been true, always will be. Now, NIRD program, as I said, went from 1955 to 1970 or so, and they did lots of experiments, first of all, in the first 5 years or so. Then they started putting together field experiments. So they'd taken the experimental trials on 6 and 8 and 12 cows, they put them into herds under real commercial circumstances. So they were testing it in real time. First experiment was 12 months, they found, oh, teat dipping is hugely beneficial. First trials that actually ever did that. And it was better than other PrEP in reducing new intramammary infections. They went on to a second experiment and included there's lots of things in these experiments. That's why I'm not going through the detail. We would be here until the whole of the NMC meeting was over to actually talk about it. But cluster pasteurization, used in many places, it actually wasn't significant in the effect of reducing new infections. We had no successful way of actually eliminating infections at the end of lactation. The only thing we had were short-acting antimicrobials. So they tested this with sodium cloxacillin at drying off. It cured some infections, but not nearly enough, because it only lasted for 2 to 3 days at the end of lactation. There was no persistency. Fortunately, at this time, Beecham's research laboratories in the UK had a very, very astute group led by George Baranda, who created a new formulation of cloxacillin, benzathine cloxacillin, in a long-acting base. And that persisted, and this was done in 1964, for up to 3 weeks. So we had the ability to get a long-acting dry cow antimicrobial. And John Oliver from what was Rhodesia then, was working at NRD on his PhD and did these trials in 64. And so the second one, he tested in the first one, the short-acting, he tested the long-acting, persisted for 3 weeks, and it gave 80% cure of existing infections and 80% prevention of new infections. Hey, we had a dry cow approach to reducing infections. All of this was wrapped up in something called Mastitis Field Experiment 3, MFE3, which was a major 3-year field trial where they had 30 herds. Now, they confused the hell out of this trial in many ways because they did all sorts of little things round about, testing, teat dipping, teat disinfection, and dry cow therapy. They had some blitz therapy in there. They had conflicts in there in terms of when they culled cows and when they didn't cull cows. And they didn't test really the culling. They didn't test the machine checking, all the things they actually included. But it was a major event to show the strategy, the 2 tenets of control, prevent new infections and reduce the duration of infections, could be done under real farm conditions. So the sort of things they achieved in it in the first 2 years anyway, the prevalence of infection dropped from 55% to 22%, 60% drop in the prevalence of infection. Streptogalactiae virtually disappeared. I despair about the fact people report Streptogalactiae. We've known from then, and back in 1950 with Stewart's work, Stableford's work, that we could actually eliminate Streptogalactiae. Clinical cases dropped 40%. Cell count almost halved. Huge variation between herds because there was a problem with compliance. It's all very well in recruiting somebody to do something. How do you monitor the guy milking the cows is actually doing it? Same problem we have today. But despite all the variation in compliance, these are the average results we got. Some of them were even better. And a big value of this over many other programs elsewhere, nobody takes any samples. Nobody sends them to a laboratory. There's minimal extra cost. It was really only the extra antimicrobials they were using. So the improvements were there, but they were progressive. They don't happen overnight. They take years to actually come to fruition. That's all described in this paper in the reading list, because this is actually not easy to get, this paper. So there's a PDF on the NMC website. You can get all of the fine details. Now, at this point, they decided to take it out to farmers generally in the UK. So they produced a leaflet. And the leaflet says, dip all teats in an effective teat dip, and various other things. And it says, give antibiotic therapy, and 2 subpoints. And it says, cull cows, even though the culling cows wasn't actually tested. 3 points with 2 subpoints. This was launched at a big conference in January 1971, and it was still confused with 3 points and 2 subpoints, what we actually want. At 1971 NMC meeting, there was a series of papers given, which were equally inconsistent and full of miscommunication. No agreement with what on earth was going on here. Now, at this point, my good friend James Booth, this is a picture of him in 1971. He's now 82, 83, still looks exactly the same. He And the reason he's probably exactly the same is because he played rugby until he was in his mid-60s, and every day he cycles. Every evening he cycles to the rugby club, to the bar, drinks 4 pints of beer, and cycles home again. James was sitting, because he was James, in a pub in London. He can't remember which because his list goes up to 396 now he's actually been involved in. Reading the NMC papers and having just been to this other conference and saying, what the hell's going on here? There's nothing simple I can get to tell people. Because he was launching his role the national cell count system in the UK at this time and was producing a magazine to go out to talk to farmers and thought, we need something simple. So the back page of that magazine reads like this. 5 points. Do you recognize the 5 points? 5 points. And if you look at the centre page, well, this is the magazine, MMB, Better Management, Mastitis, the Annual Toll. The centre page is this poster. One of the girls in the office drew these cartoons round about the five points. And in the bottom there is, when you get your cell count results, you can plot them and show what effect you're actually making the prevalence of infection measured as cell count. So this was launched in 1971. But of course, farmers actually want more proof than that. So James got together his technical group. He had a number of technicians, and he set up one trial in the north of England and one in the south of England, identical. South of England trial was run by a guy called Graham Dewars, who was born in Kenya, raised in New Zealand, was on what New Zealanders do, an overseas experience in the UK with his wife for 3 years, worked for James, and ran this trial. Come back to Graham shortly. And the trials they actually were going on there, Cornell was involved in this, because remember Frank Dodd was heavily involved with Cornell, having been there in sabbatical. Cornell started in '68, 2 years after NIRD, doing a similar trial to NFE3, except they didn't have benzathine cloxacillin, because it wasn't available in North America at that time. But they got very similar results, and they also measured production increase from reducing prevalence of infection. James's MMB trials, which ran 71 to 73, also got a drop in cell count, not as big, but much bigger for the high cell count herds, got the same increase in milk yield. Again, a load of farmers wouldn't comply, but that's real life. And also found that 50% of the machines were faulty despite them being tested. And that's not changed. We've had here in recent years reports and posters that 50% of machines are still faulty despite being tested. There's also another trial in the south of England, my good friend, the late David Thornton, who actually produced the money for my first mastitis project ever, and that did a similar thing with only veterinary supervision. So lots of people were applying it here, getting very similar results. And it went on to be done in different countries as well. Now at this point, Graham Dewars and his wife had gone back to New Zealand, and he was hired by a group called the Waikato Milk Lab. And at New Zealand at this time, they were about to set up a national milk quality system. And Graham joined a group led by someone called Alan Blue Toomey and John Millen, other people who must be recognised for their role, and said, what do we do in New Zealand? Well, Graham went back and told them what was actually happening in the UK. And they came up with this leaflet in October '74 that said, for mastitis control, you require a 5-point plan. And he used this very simple thing that Graham had been testing in the UK, put it onto the finger, and isn't it simple if you're talking to somebody who doesn't speak the same language as you, who may not have the same level of education as you, to be able to point out very simply the 5 things you actually need to do. And they launched this in New Zealand, and had to find ways of engaging with the people they wanted to convince to do this. And remember, this was back in the mid-1970s. Now, here's the timeline for where we are at this point, just to draw a picture here. At the top, we've got all the NIRD stuff culminating in the MFE3 and the leaflet launched. Cornell coming in here to make their significant contribution as well, what they're doing. Now, NIRD persisted, or Frank Dodd in particular, persisted in always talking about his 3 points in his 2 sub-point plan. Never mentioned a 5-point plan. Right until 1986 was the first time he ever mentions 5 points. And I worked with Frank. And we always talked about 5 points, but he never described it to anybody else as a 5-point plan. You go and look somewhere else. Beecham's, who developed the dry cow, produced a plan that they got included in Black's Veterinary Dictionary. To this day, Black's Veterinary Dictionary talks about the Beecham's version of 6 points. No mention whatsoever in that classical text of a 5-point plan. I've talked to Tony Andrews, the editor, and he said, well, you'd better write a new entry for me, hadn't you? But it's the Milk Marketing Board 5-point plan that James produced in 71 and tested over those 2 years that went on in the New Zealand program came in 74, 75. That's when we started to recognise a 5-point plan. And we didn't know this until we went to Delve and talked to all these guys in their 80s and trying to find out what on earth was going on. And the key to the 5-point plan and translating it is actually extension. NIRD had this science approach, and because they were scientists, the pharmaceutical industry was doing what they did, and they actually came up with 6 points. But the farmer-focused MMB plan with posters and cartoons and the 5 points that are easy to recognise and remember came out of it. And the New Zealand contribution here was to find ways of engaging and building by, to some extent, entertainment. And I'll show you what that looks like. They produced another series of leaflets. This is by a very famous cartoonist in New Zealand. Let's stamp out mastitis. Get it to farmers, things they can see and understand. And the plans are to check machines, which I've already said, checking machines is no damn good unless you actually fix the damn things and make them work properly. So I've made my own alterations to the cartoon. Spray teats. New Zealanders, they like to spray. Dipping's far too difficult. Well, I don't want to go there. I need another 3 days. But get disinfectant onto teats. Not spray, disinfect teats. Treat clinical cases. Now, for those of the younger people in the room here, this instrument is called a telephone. And in New Zealand at this time, not only did you have a telephone, you had a party line. And that's where you actually shared a telephone line with all your neighbours. And you see Jim's nodding, he knows all about this. And you phoned the veterinarian to consult on treating cows. You just go do things. It's a veterinary problem. So this is what this was about. And you use dry cow therapy, as it said there. And you'll notice there, you actually have proper ways of preparing teats. I haven't time to tell you the story about the mastitis storm farm I was called into, and we wondered why things were actually going on until we actually tested the disinfectant, the alcohol bottle that the farmer actually had, and he'd actually been drinking it and topping it up with water, and so he's preparing teats with nothing but clean water. Cull crook cows. Crook is an Australian New Zealand word for sick cows. So it's the 5-point plan laid out in cartoons by a fairly famous New Zealand cartoonist at the time. It's about engaging with people and getting them to actually understand and a little bit of entertainment along the way. Now, the people who were doing all of this had to travel long distances in New Zealand in primitive cars over primitive roads with no radio reception or anything whatsoever. So to entertain themselves for driving out to farmers groups to talk, they, some of them were musicians, they used to play musical instruments and make up lyrics using common tunes. And they produced this long playing record in 1975. They're gathering together 14 of these, mostly totally forgettable songs. They got some money from a budget that was left over, I think it was $900 or something, and went to a studio in Auckland to record this. When the government in Wellington found out about this, all hell broke loose. But by this time, the records had all been sold, it had been played on national radio, and been played internationally, and it was a success. So the government had to say, well, one of our best ideas, wasn't it? So I'll play a minute or so of this so you can actually see what this is about. It's 1975, remember.
The disease mastitis causes the New Zealand dairy farmer a heartache every year, and of course the dairy industry loses valuable production. Mastitis can be controlled and those losses can be prevented by following a simple 5-point control program.
There were long trips. These tracks are actually available on the internet in very poor version. I had them digitized and remastered, so if you really want a copy, you feel free. So, where we've got to now is the timeline, and what I've added on here at the very bottom is NMC 1975. Because in 1975 at the annual meeting, James Booth gave 2 papers, one on his National Cell Service and the other one on the MMB trials. And only at that point does 5-point plan come into the NMC vocabulary. So that's what actually happened with all these trials going on. I'm going to move on. Just the success of the plan, I'll talk very briefly about. This is a herd in the UK that we actually had as a research herd. Back in '76, you can see where all the mastitis is, all the contagious Staph aureus, bit of agalactiae, dysgalactiae. A few years after the plan was involved, we've got the levels of this down significantly, and even more so with progression, we get them down even more so. Similarly, a contribution but not entirely responsible for reducing national cell count, things like the EU Milk Hygiene Directive and other things as well. Progressively, you can reduce the prevalence of infection and the number of clinical cases by being diligent in applying the 5-point plan. All plans have limits. People are the biggest limit. They say they'll do something, they don't do something. You know, getting onto the farm at 4 a.m. on a Sunday morning to check they're actually doing the right things, it's not easy. It involves more than just the people on the farm. It's veterinarians, it's advisors, it's everybody else who's actually involved. People are the real limitations. There were technological limitations. At the beginning, there were primitive disinfectants. In MFE3, we got the first of the new generation iodine disinfectants, significantly better. Remember, we had also in MFE3 benzothine cloxacillin, the first real dry cow product. So technology developments were very important then, still remain so today, and that's why the future actually has to be examined for that particular purpose. There were actually challenges to say it doesn't actually do anything for strep uberus and gram-negative bacteria. I'll come back to that in a second, perhaps, because if you actually look at this, and I've looked at the original MFE3 data on clinicals, the uberus here is in the green. It did actually half the uberus, and that's in the MFE3 data as well. It didn't give you 80% reduction, but it gave you a 50% reduction. It didn't do a lot on gram-negatives. But then at the time, this is confused because dairy systems were changing. We were going from 30 cow herds to 60 cow herds to 200 cow herds to thousands of cows in herds now. So the system has changed. You can't expect it all to be relevant and real going forward. Now, NMC, after a whole number of years, said 5-point plan too simple. We need to do something more. It produced a 10-point plan. A 10-point plan that doesn't tell you anything to do, actually. It's a lot of words, doesn't tell you what to do. Because the plan is underneath all of this, and if you look on the NMC website, what the 10-point plan actually is, it's a 65-point plan. I challenge you to get people milking cows who may have language or cultural barriers to understand. It's 5 points are hard enough. 65? Give up, get another job. So, the 5 points were what this was all about, something simple. Yeah? And maybe, however, we could rewrite it, and my suggestion is to rewrite it. Make sure the milking machine always works. Don't just test the things. Cull cows with chronic mastitis. Get these things done first, up front. Disinfect every teat of every cow after every milking. Not just teat them. Identify and treat appropriately every sign of clinical mastitis. You don't just treat the cause, you may actually want to treat the symptoms and things as well. And this is something for actually later today. Not mentioning dry cow therapy. Apply a clear end of lactation therapy and prevention strategy. Still tells you specific things to do. Anyway, that's my suggestion where we could actually go, having learned from all of this. So, summarise here. We've got a great story here. It's been great thinking. Lots of technical innovation in it. Good science underpinning all of it. Whole number of tests and field trials to show that it actually works under commercial circumstances. And it's important to find the right ways of selling and engaging it. And it's a classical thing in extension. What we've actually got, it's KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. Thanks to the original teams. And a lot of other people have given me useful information. Jacob and Graham from Australia. Graham Dewars, as I mentioned, who has given me a lot of the material. Other people on here, both in the UK and the US. Thank you, everybody, for helping me get the material for this. Finding out things we didn't actually know had happened in terms of the story. Now, people ask me why I actually still work in mastitis all this years. What a failure you must have been. You're all failures at the same. We're still working here after decades. C.D. Wilson, who's a veterinarian in the MFE3 trial, published much earlier in the veterinary record this. Mastitis is similar to the poor. We shall always have it with us. It means you've got a job for a time yet, folks. And you need to find a way of actually talking to the farmers.
Any old cow on any old farm's likely to get mastitis. They look neat, standing on their feet, but wait till they get inflammation in their teeth. Use our plan, a 5-point plan, a plan you can rely on. Improve milk quality on the farm. No more mastitis.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much, Eric. Certainly appreciate that introduction to the start of the program. And when we tossed around this idea of who could present the history, Eric's name came up first, and certainly, as you can see, he's not only lived it, but has a great story to tell as well. So very much appreciate that. So to continue the story, perhaps, so that was a little bit of the past. We come to the present, and as Eric alluded to at the end of his presentation, technologies have continued to evolve. We've continued to learn things, and I think one of the challenges is how do we incorporate this new knowledge into our fundamental control programs, and how do we layer that or incorporate some of that into the 5-point plan. So that leads us then to our second presentation of this morning, and it's entitled 5 Points to Revise the 5-Point Mastitis Control Plan. Our speaker is somebody a little bit younger than Eric. Chris Scherpenzeel comes to us from the Netherlands. He hails originally from Belgium, did his veterinary degree at Ghent University and spent some time in practice, in dairy practice, and then completed a PhD at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. In 2011, he joined the GD Animal Health in Deventer in the Netherlands as a dairy specialist. And Chris works to integrate the current best knowledge that we have about mastitis and mastitis control into practical udder health programs that dairy producers and veterinarians can use. And so it's my great pleasure to welcome Chris to the podium.
Having heard the great story from Dr. Hillerton, a point to revising the 5 points plan, And that's actually the reason I tried better to call it refining the 5 points plan. Together with Inte Schukken, the co-author of this presentation, who unfortunately was not able to attend this year the NMC, and his co-workers at Cornell, I tried to, well, get you through some newest developments in mastitis work which may refine the 5 point plan. So 5 points to revise or 5 points to refine the 5 points mastitis control plan. Based in Deventer, I'm humbled that I can do a lot of mastitis research work in the field, as well as doing it close to the cows and close to the farmers. But to approach it scientifically as a veterinary doctor, that's great. And actually, well, in my spare free time, I have to raise a new generation of mastitis workers, and they're quite interested in doing so. But hopefully they help me through this presentation to do so. And revising this 5 point mastitis control plan, well, actually the backbone of this 5 point control plan is still very actual and very relevant. We see here what was the past and where do we came from. 5 points evolved to 10 points, maybe 65 points, but to my opinion, revising it, well, it is quite ridiculous. And when somebody asks me, when you do it, it's quite utterly ridiculous. But they say, well, you have this fun run tonight. It's called the Utterly Ridiculous Fun Run in Arizona. And, well, that's great to do so. Yesterday we had this full moon here in Arizona. And I think somebody trained for this fun run. So we'll get through this in about 30 minutes to do so. With new developments as inspiration for revision. And these topics I try to highlight in 30 minutes. Well, this fasten seatbelt sign will be switched on, because within 30 minutes trying to get through all this is quite a challenge. So stay tuned. And let's start with the mammary microbiome. What is the milk microbiome? The microbial populations as found using next generation sequencing. And of course we have the classical bacteriology with biochemical testing, which is still a good golden standard. But with the techniques running through, we have now pyrosequencing. And we can use 16S sequencing to find out the bacterial DNA in milk. We have great definitions on intramammary infection. We have great definitions what we call an intramammary infection based on morphology on the plates and counts on the plates. But this is a whole new world running up, and approximately 7,000 bacterial sequences are found in milk, covering over 1,000 bacterial species in 1 milliliter. So that's quite interesting. Well, there has been done quite some work over the last few years, and finding out the bovine milk microbiome in healthy quarters, you can see that there are over, well, up to 1,500 species and, well, up to 7,000 sequences found in healthy milk. And then it's interesting to find out when there are mastitic quarters, then there is a reduction in diversity within those quarters. And for example, when there is a Treponella pyogenes, formerly known as Arcanobacter pyogenes, it's a very dominant bug in the milk, which can reduce the diversity, well, to maybe 100 sorts of species in milk. So that's actually quite new in having definitions on intramammary infections. Interestingly, we have to find out, well, what happens when we have different groups of quarters showing inflammation. Because that has somatic cell counts in different categories. They show us the response of inflammation, but it's not primarily that we show infection. Well, seeing these 5 types of groups of quarters, with the 5th category having clinical mastitis, all being negative on aerobic culture, showing a large diversity of different bugs, well, up from Astica caulus, Porphyromonas species, Bacteroides. Well, it's quite a zoo of different bugs which are, well, not acknowledged as major mastitis pathogens yet. When we look further on in the microbiome of healthy quarters, you see again in a recent paper from 2016 that there are still so many different bacteria around in well, as we defined it as healthy quarters, having a low cell count, under 20,000 cells per mil, negatively anaerobic culture, showing a very large diversity of bugs around. Well, over the years, the last few years, there were quite some papers running up about this subject, not only in the milk microbiome, but the gut microbiome. There are a lot of microbiomes around in biology, so that's interesting, but of course our focus is more and more on mastitis work. So knowing that the microbiome is a sort of ecosystem, it's very interesting to see, and it's work from Professor Scheffer from Wageningen University, that we speak about ecosystems like a sort of ecologic resilience. How stable are ecosystems given a sort of change in how they are interacting in that system? And when there is a sort of threshold, and you want to find a new situation in which your ecosystem needs to balance out, you can be quite resilient when you have to deal with a change in your situations in the system. And we know that on a larger scale, for example, for tropical rainforests. We know it, for example, for the coral reefs. Yeah? There is a tipping point from which there is an imbalance and the system cannot handle it anymore. Well, the same goes maybe for the udder. And the mastitic ecosystem and the milk microbiome could be imbalanced as well. And some cows are more susceptible to a dominant bug than others are. So interesting to find out how that works and how challenges in that system will have an effect. Well, the challenges we have are of course the challenges with dominant strains, E. coli, our major mastitis pathogens, but you could see a challenge as well as having an antimicrobial therapy within that quarter, because that challenges the system as well, having the commensal flora around in the teat. So we have high resilient and lower resilient udders and quarters in our cows. And maybe there is an hypothesis in human medicine that when your age is getting up, you get more frail in your ecosystem. So it's not resilient anymore, and you, well, with a disturbance, you will have a very frail system, and you cannot handle the infection. So interesting work for mastitis. So Erika Genda from the Cornell group published a great paper on when you challenge those cows, how will it affect the mammary microbiome? And what she did, she took a bunch of cows, which she challenged with, oh, excuse me for that. She challenged those quarters with an E. coli strain, for a known E. coli strain. And she randomly assigned them to having a ceftiofur treatment within that quarters or not. So having a control group as well. So we can have 4 different types of quarters involved, being challenged or not, and being treated or not. And the treatment was 48 hours after the initial challenge, following the label for ceftiofur having 5 treatments with a good interval, following the SPC. So results from this interesting study, you see 4 types of bars with the relative abundance of the different pathogens involved. For the quarters that were not treated and not challenged, those were challenged at time point 0, and the ones who were treated at 5 times with the ceftiofur treatment. And what is most interestingly, of course, when you challenge the quarters with E. coli, you see a very dominancy of the Enterobacteriaceae group, but they are quite dominant. So the diversity within those quarters is really imbalanced. There is one dominant bug around, and there is a big loss of diversity when you challenge those quarters. Then what is the effect of treatment? And actually what is interesting to see, that the treatment reduces the loss of diversity within those quarters. And I'll show you in the next few slides more in detail. So at point 0, you challenge those quarters with E. coli, and you see in green the challenged untreated quarters, and in red the challenged and treated quarters. There is a significant difference over time that the challenged untreated quarters have a higher count of Enterobacter species as compared to the challenged treated quarters. So that is a big effect. When you have a more look at the Shannon Diversity Index, so the diversity of the bugs around, then there is a significant difference after the challenge of having the treated quarters having a higher diversity as compared to the untreated quarters. So that means the effect of antimicrobials on those quarters makes that there is a reduced loss of diversity in the quarters. So appropriate treatment at the time of having a mastitis will work out. When we see the healthy quarters, so unchallenged and untreated, so what is the effect of those antibiotics? Well, still the diversity index stays on a high level. So that's very good that there is a capability of the animal to deal with the antimicrobials. So, take-home messages for the microbial ecosystems. The mammary gland of dairy cows harbors a microbial ecosystem. The challenge results in the intermammary challenge results in a loss of bacterial diversity. Some cows are more resilient to exotic bacterial growth compared to other more susceptible cows. And immediate appropriate antibacterial treatment results in reduced loss of diversity. So interesting work from the mammary microbiome perspective. Then switching to mammary immune biology, there is a great importance of the dry period. And we know from studies from before that the intramammary infections that we have that manifest in the early lactation, so after parturition, have their origin of being infected in a dry period. And well, the types of bugs around, they change over the different countries, but most of them, the environmentals, will come from the dry period. Then it's interesting to see that when you challenge cows in the work from Cresnell from 2012, that when you challenge those quarters at time point 0, you see a sort of depression of the colony forming units during that dry period. And from parturition and onwards, you see a very large increase of CFUs of E. coli in those affected quarter or challenged quarter. So there is a sort of depression going on, or an anti-inflammatory response during the dry period. When we look at the inflammatory response as measured by the cytokine, interleukin-1 beta, as a profound pro-inflammatory cytokine, you see that during the dry period, it's quite on low levels. And from the day of parturition, this cow was giving labor at 13 days after drying off, and after challenge. You see that there is an increase in those cytokines. So again, this shows that there is probably in late gestation a mainly anti-inflammatory response. When you compare it to the mid-lactation, when you challenge those quarters at point 0, you see that in mid-lactation, those cytokines increase after you challenge those quarters. So from immune perspective, there is quite some imbalance in the Th1, Th2 response. It was lately, go back again, yeah. This was shown in the paper from Brianna Pomeroy et al. From 2015, that the pregnancy steroid hormones, like estradiol, progesterone, do affect the upregulation of the CD80 and MHC2 as moderators of the inflammatory response. And there is an enhanced IL-10 production, which moderates the inflammation as well. So that means, to summarize, that, well, in the last trimester of the gestation, there is a more anti-inflammatory response as compared to a pro-inflammatory response in early dry period. So this imbalance is very interesting to see, and well, will give a new insight on how we have to deal with immune biology in the dry period. How can we intervene then? Because that is very interesting. We have a lot of interesting work done on the interventions. Well, within our immune system, we have, of course, our innate and our adaptive immune system. We have our anatomical barriers, like the teeth end, which we need to optimize and keep in good health. The humoral responses, like lactoferrin, the antibacterial compound in milk. And, of course, our cellular responses, like having potent neutrophils killing the bugs when they enter the teeth canal. And our adaptive system, the antibody-driven immunity, and our memory-driven cellular responses. And of course with vaccination as a sort of intervention, as well as improving the innate immunity by improving teeth end quality, higher levels of lactoferrin, or reducing the negative energy balance, will modulate the immune system. And it's very interesting to see the latest research on the different types of vaccines and immune modulators, because immune modulation is more and more running up, and very interesting work has been done and published as well. For example, the bovine granulocyte colony stimulating factor, which enhances neutrophil function, published by Hasfurther in 2015, which shows interesting work on the incidence of clinical mastitis as an output parameter for neutrophil function and effectivity and potency of killing an intramammary bug, which shows that, well, clinical mastitis incidence is very low when you have a 20 microgram per kilo of the Pec-Bovie factor in the milk. Then, of course, we have some work on vaccination. Wilson from 2006, and there are quite more papers on vaccine work in the dairy udder. But E. coli challenge study shows that it reduces severity, and the milk production is reduced when you immunize those quarters and those cows. But latest research on UV irradiated E. coli giving as an intramammary shot, so a sort of intramammary immunization, shows interesting data on the number of colony-forming units in those quarters, so that after parturition, you see that the challenged quarters show a much significant lower colony-forming unit number as compared to the untreated controls. And the probability for having an intramammary infection after parturition is significantly lower in those that were treated intramammarily with UV irradiated E. coli. So that makes sense, and that shows, well, in this summary picture from Pomeroy, that there are a lot of modifications and immune modulation and immune stimulators around which we can use to optimize our immune system. Well, we know that this imbalance between the Th1 and Th2 responses makes sense, and probably nature shows that giving birth to your newborn has to interact with your responses on infection and your inflammatory response. So this makes sense, and therefore the results in high susceptibility to intramammary infection in late gestation, that's the result of this, and maybe then we could enhance this immune response by improving the pro-inflammatory immune response in late gestation. So, coming to the next round about judicious antimicrobial use, giving some new lights on how we can cope up and refine the 5 points plan. Well, why this focus? There was mainly, well, in some countries, an overuse of the same types of antibiotics in veterinary medicine as there was in human medicine, and humans were exposed to antimicrobial resistant pathogens. There were some incidents in the world, the methicillin resistant Staph aureus and the extended spectrum beta-lactamase producing bugs, which made that, well, there were more and more intention of trying to find a relationship between antimicrobial resistance and the use of antimicrobials. Well, seeing data, resistance data from the Netherlands, we saw that in dairy cows up to 2009, there was an increase of resistant data in dairy, but as you compare it to the swine, poultry and the veal industry, well, the dairy cow industry did actually quite well as compared to those livestock industries. But up to 2009, there was this urgency. And from then, it resulted that the critically important antibiotics were banned in the Netherlands. And from 2012, it was at very low level. So then it's interesting to see how those antimicrobial resistance data evaluated over time. And that's what we see here, that from 2009, we used less and less antimicrobials, but the resistance data in dairy went down as well. And when we have a look at, again, the veal industry or the poultry or beef cattle, there's still a way to go in reducing those resistant bugs. How we see that the antimicrobial use in the Netherlands is focusing over time. Well, 2009 was the reference year, and probably you hear more about it in the presentation of Dr. van Werven tomorrow in the featured symposium on selective dry cow therapy. How this worked out by legislation. But from 2009, it was the reference year, setting up in 100%. But over the years, veterinary antimicrobial use in the livestock industry decreased. And we're now, and the 2017 numbers are running up, but probably we have reduced 70% of antimicrobial use in the dairy industry. Then it's interesting to find out how animal health is doing right now. Well, as we had a look at the human E. coli over the years, then we see actually from 2009, there still is an increase in the commensal E. coli in humans. So relationships between veterinary use and resistant strains in humans, well, there are some more factors involved in that. Well, work from Marina Stevens from the Belgian group shows that antimicrobial use on farms shows a big variation. And this is the critically important antimicrobials which are used for animal health as defined by the World Health Organization. That the ADD, the average daily dosage, as a measurement for animal antimicrobial use on farm, it shows a very large diversity over a large number of herds. And then, well, to reduce antimicrobials in the dairy industry, we should have a focus on mastitis treatment on the one side, and of course the dry cow treatment on the other side. And there are quite some interesting papers running up from some years ago, but there are some more to come about treatment of E. coli mastitis, for example, and how can we intervene in optimizing the effects of antimicrobials. And work from Anja Sipka, published in 2014 and 2015, shows the effect of treating coliform mastitis with cefapirine, with prednisolone, so a corticosteroid with it, an anti-inflammatory, showing that 18 hours and 24 hours post-challenge respectively, you see a large effect of the anti-inflammatory. But it's interesting to find out whether there is the effect of the anti-inflammatory corticosteroid or is it the antimicrobial involved. And well, more and more research, we should find out whether or not we should treat coliform mastitis with antimicrobials or not. And when we want to reduce antimicrobials, well, where to begin? Then some new interesting stuff on homeopathy for clinical mastitis, published in Dairy Science from, well, quite recently from Ebert et al. The effect in a double-blind randomized trial. The Kaplan-Meier curve shows how they, what's the analysis of survival. And actually there was no increased effect of homeopathy over the control groups. And of course, well, you should read the paper about which types of homeopathy was taken. But it's good to have more and more. There are different types of preparates around to be used in treating clinical mastitis. But it's good, and I really, well, assign those authors for doing this work on trying to find out on good science whether it works or not. Then finally, the dry cow treatment. We did with the group in Utrecht and in Deventer the selective dry cow treatment group. Finding out how it worked when you select cows for dry cow treatment by using the somatic cell count at the last milk recording before drying off. And well, finding out that when you don't use antimicrobial therapy at dry off in low somatic cell count cows, being defined as multiparous cows under 250k and heifers under 150k, it results in a, well, nearly 2 times higher incidence of clinical mastitis and a 2 times higher incidence of subclinical mastitis, being defined as a somatic cell count at quarter level of 200,000. This was a study using low somatic cell count cows at quarter level. We did some more work which was published on herd level, and then we saw that on herd level those effects were not as big as they were here. So a doubling increase in clinical mastitis, that's quite a challenge. But we found out that on herd level the effect is much less. Well, recent work on this economics, because, well, I look forward to the featured symposium tomorrow, and everybody will hopefully attend to that, and we can discuss this as well. The economic argument to find out whether it is an argument to whether or not to reduce dry cow antimicrobials. And we found out by using a linear programming model, together with Henk Hogeveen from Wageningen University, that economics is not an argument against reduction of dry cow antimicrobials by applying selective dry cow treatment. Well, in the Netherlands, and you'll hear more about it tomorrow in the afternoon, it became obligatory in 2013. We launched a guideline which says multiparous cows 50,000 cells and heifers 150,000 cells as criterion, using a somatic cell count. So there is interesting, very great science done by selecting cows in a different way, using bulk tank somatic cell count or using culture plates. So, well, the crazy Dutch people use a somatic cell count to select their cows. But the most important was that changing the mindset of farmers and veterinarians was of major importance. And that's what it's all about. I heard it in the presentation of Dr. Hillerton. It's people, people, people. And I think that's the main conclusion we saw in the Netherlands, that changing the people will upgrade the animal health. Well, showing you the percentage of cows treated with dry cow therapy, so antimicrobial dry cow therapy, over the years from 2008 to 2016 in the Netherlands. Well, actually, we come from up to 80% in 2008, and we went down to under 30% in 2015. Well, we set up a lot of work. We had some sort of psychology courses with the animals. We call it the Lactators Anonymous. With them, speaking about how they were doing within the me-moo discussion as well. And, well, interesting to find out how is it doing with animal health. What is the effect on animal health by using data, monitoring data from all the different parties in the Netherlands. And this is what we see, that the percentage of cows with an elevated somatic cell count over those time, the trend shows that it's going down under 18% now. And the bulk tank somatic cell count over time went down to under 190. So this means animal health hasn't been as good as ever in the Netherlands by reducing the dry cow injectors with 48%. So that's, well, quite interesting work for many other countries probably. Well, Biggs published in 2016 other thresholds. As I said, we could use the bulk milk somatic cell count to use as a startup, and then selecting on cow level which cows you want to use. But there are still way many other ways to select cows, for example, using culture, using quarter culture, and different diagnostics as well to select your cows for dry cow therapy. Well, I saw on the University of Minnesota a very interesting sentence, selective dry cow therapy, we can do this, from the Sandra Godden group, of course, past president from NMC. And I wanted to put it in because, well, I'm really hope that, well, and we see tomorrow in the featured symposium how it will work out in the rest of the world as well. What can help as an innovation could help the bulk tank milk antimicrobial resistance profiles. When there are a lot of resistant bugs around in bulk tank, it can guide you for farm-specific protocols and supports more prudent and judicious use of antibiotics. This is an example from New Zealand, which is used to interpret the results. But to my opinion, and the World Health Organization set on this holistic approach on antimicrobials, as little as possible and as much as necessary. But of course, when there are cows having an antibacterial infection, as veterinarians and farmers, we should still need to treat those animals. It is in our power to do so, but it starts with awareness and education. Well, I don't go through all these points, but maybe they can help within setting up a new point plan, but the holistic approach uses people to do so. And that will be caught in a dairy herd health plan, which may help to make specific management advice in changing the mindset of the farmers and their veterinarians. This will improve animal health by using less but strategic antibiotics, and in this way it makes animal health management more transparent, because all the people working on the farm can comply to this herd health management plan, and therefore they are helped to reduce their antimicrobials. Well, where is the mammary herd most healthy? Well, we discussed quite some points, but this is a 3D way of trying to find out where the animals should be in a herd. Well, it's over here, by just giving the right treatments and of course still cull the right animals from the old 5-point plan. But of course, their susceptibility by their microbiome and how resilient are our quarters in our cows, this will help. But to reduce the duration of intramammary infection and to reduce the risk of intramammary infection by transmissions, and of course the milking procedures that will help out, make a healthy herd and probably reduce mastitis in the world more and more. To sum up, take-home messages all about balance and hopefully inspiration for the new revised 5-point plan. It's still very relevant and actual and can be managed to control mastitis. Understanding resilience in microbial ecosystems in the mammary glands is of crucial importance to optimize mammary health. Optimal immune stimulation and modulation in late gestation will have a major impact on reducing intramammary infections. Specifically for the dry period, but of course to prevent clinical disease postpartum. And new developments in our understanding of mammary health continue to be plentiful. So hopefully there will be a more 60 years of NMC with great research, but also great practice we can have on these stages to have some great careers in the mastitis work. And with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm willing to take any of your questions. Yeah.
I think in the interest of time, we'll perhaps limit it to one question, but if anyone has a question, please stand up, speak loudly, and I will repeat the question so that everyone hears it. The question refers to the early part of the presentation on microbial biome, and that a lot of that diversity actually falls into categories that are perhaps unclassified.
Actually, there were more bacteries around. She took the 25 most prevalent ones within those quarters by 16S. So there were quite some more. But, well, we do not recognize them as major mastitis pathogens yet. And probably it is the commensal flora being part of a healthy microbiome and having, for example, strep uterus was part of a healthy microbiome. But when it gets a dominant one and it over-dominates the other commensal bugs around, then it is an issue, and she got clinical. So all the bugs we saw by 16S were probably the resistant or the commensal flora, but we do not define them as major pathogens. Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much for your question. Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. So we'll move to our last speaker of the morning, and again, Chris has set that up nicely with his discussions about some of the pressures being applied to our dairy production systems, in particular based on pressures to reduce antimicrobial use and so forth. Our next speaker, I think, will give us a broader perspective on some of the things that are coming into play as we move into the future and some of the pressures that will continue to be applied in various ways to our dairy production systems as we try to continue to implement the 5-point plan and maintain high milk quality. I'm very pleased to welcome Jamie Jonker. Jamie is the VP of Sustainability and Scientific Affairs for National Milk Producers Federation. Jamie did grow up on a dairy farm in New York, did his undergrad work at Cornell and PhD at the University of Maryland. He joined National Milk Producers Federation in 2005 and has had quite a lengthy portfolio of activities in that organization. His responsibilities range over a broad area of a number of broad areas, including animal health and welfare, animal biotechnology, dairy farm biosecurity, and dairy farm air and water quality, amongst others. And so who better to speak to us about some of the issues that we face as we move forward and try to maintain this high reputation of milk quality in our dairy industries than Jamie. Please join me in welcoming Jamie to the stage.
So it's my pleasure to be here today. Appreciate the opportunity to give maybe a little different type of view on some of the pressures that are coming in terms of udder health. And so when I was thinking about what I could do here in my presentation, I thought about, well, what are customers and consumers really asking about udder health? Just a little background, where are we in terms of the U.S.? Mastitis is still our #1 animal health issue that we have. In our dairy cattle, we use therapeutic uses, treatment during lactation, and some stuff here out of the 2014 USDA Dairy National Animal Health Monitoring Survey. Roughly 1/4 of our cows develop clinical mastitis during lactation. About 90%, almost 90% of those are then treated. So you can do the math there. About 93% of our cows receive dry cow treatment. That's virtually every cow that is in what I'll call conventional production systems. The vast majority of those 7% that do not receive dry cow treatment would be in our organic production systems, where if they used an antibiotic on them, they would no longer be able to be in those organic production systems. So our dairy customer and consumer interest really is around milk quality and antimicrobial use, resulting in what we look at in terms of udder health. If you were to go down to a supermarket and just ask people as they were pulling a gallon of milk out of the dairy case or buying a pound of cheese, what are your concerns about udder health? One, the supermarket will ask you to leave politely, and then after 3 or 4 times they will have you physically removed. Not that I've ever done that. But they really don't know about udder health. But they want to know about the quality of the product, and they want to know about how that product is produced, the health of the animals, what goes into that production system, including the use of antibiotics and antimicrobials. And so while they may not have direct concerns about udder health, when you add in consumer and customer concerns about milk quality and antibiotic use, they really do have interest in udder health. My presentation here is going to be kind of a little bit free-flowing as to how various factors of what consumers and customers are asking and demanding, and some of the regulatory issues surrounding antibiotic use and how they fit into the overall aspects of where do we need to go in the future of udder health, I think, at least from a U.S. perspective. The International Food Information Council does annual surveys in the U.S. about consumer confidence in the food production systems. And here from their survey published last year looking at their confidence in the food production systems, antimicrobial use, antibiotic use in animals is not a top-of-mind issue. If you look there, I think it's number 6. But when you look at people that rank at either their first, second, or third most concerning issue in food production in the U.S., about 25% of respondents say that they have concerns about the use of antibiotics in our animal production systems. I think another interesting thing from the same survey is where do they get their information on this from? Circling in here on our animal antibiotics, you'll see that their information does not come from you. It's not the National Mastitis Council. It's not scientific information. You'll see that that's the third part there. It's from newspaper and media headlines. It's from family and friends. They're getting information from places that are not from necessarily a scientific aspect. And they're using this information to influence their buying decisions. But there is a recognition that animals do get sick and they do need to be treated. In their survey from 2016, they asked specifically about whether or not antibiotics should be used to treat sick animals. Almost 75%. 3 out of every 4 said that yes, when an animal is sick and it's appropriate to use antibiotics, then antibiotics should be used to treat that condition in the animal. So there is a recognition that our livestock do become ill, and when they become ill, if antibiotics are the right decision to make them healthy, that it's appropriate to use antibiotics. At the same time, they want more oversight in that process. 3 and 5 would be more confident that veterinarians and farms are using antibiotics responsibly if the FDA requires veterinary oversight for the use of all antibiotics. That's not the case in the U.S. right now. Many antibiotics are required to have a prescription, but some are available over the counter. But we also have, how are those antibiotics used on the individual farm? Even if they are prescription, are they actually being used in line with the prescription on that? So we do have a lot of underlying regulations and guidances that come out through our Food and Drug Administration that do help set the, I'll call it the minimums in terms of the how, why, when, and where of the use of antibiotics in our dairy production systems. We have FDA Guidance 144, which is guidance where for antibiotic use to be registered in food-producing animals, that they have to characterize the potential to select for resistant bacteria of human health concern. FDA Guidance 152 outlines a risk assessment approach for evaluating AMR resulting from the use of drugs in food-producing animals, and ranks classes of antimicrobials. Important, semi-important, rather not important. Their terms are a little bit more specific than that. Guidance 209, 213, and the Veterinary Feed Directive that all came out within the last 3 years have removed the uses of drugs in livestock production systems in the U.S. for production purposes. So these are antibiotics that have been used for growth promotion purposes, generally speaking, not in dairy production systems. We use our drugs a little bit differently in dairy than we might do in poultry or pork or in beef, but removing the routine feeding of these drugs for efficiency claims. But those are only for drugs that are medically important. A key part of this that is part of the U.S. dairy sector and is used around the world is the use of ionophores. Uses coccidiostats, a label claim in the U.S. on that product for improving milk solids. Because ionophores classified in the U.S. as antibiotics, but only used in animals, so not used in humans, not medically important, not subject to these restrictions. We did see with the Veterinary Feed Directive, when that went through, there were actually a couple of changes that happened. Not only taking 209 and 213 of removing the uses of those antibiotics for medically important antibiotics for efficiency purposes, but the Feed Directive took anything that was administered through feed that's a medically important antibiotic and essentially moved it to what I'll call a prescription status. A Veterinary Feed Directive is a written form about how you use that antibiotic that must be used exactly as it was approved by the FDA and on the label directions from the manufacturer if it's done through feed. In the dairy sector in the U.S., there's a handful of drugs that does impact. For the treatment, control, and prevention of bacterial scours and bacterial pneumonia in our growing animals, there's actually no drugs that are approved for feed, medically important drugs for our lactating animals. It did also affect some of those same drugs that are fed through water. They did not move to a veterinary feed directive prescription process, but they did move from over-the-counter to prescription status. But outside of the U.S., there are also a lot of other organizations that have an influence on what antibiotic use might look like on the dairy farm. and in livestock production in general. So we have the World Organization for Animal Health, the OIE, which is our international, intergovernmental, global animal health authority. They have standards on the judicious and responsible use of antibiotics in food production systems. We have the FAO, which works in developing nations to help do capacity building for the judicious and responsible use of antibiotics in our livestock production systems. You have the WHO looking at it from a human health perspective. The use of antibiotics in human situations, medical settings, but also a joint process through FAO and the WHO, the Codex process, which is international food safety standards. And I'll get a little bit more into that in the next slide as to some things that are happening there now. And back in September of 2016, the United Nations made a global health directive about the importance of maintaining the use of our antibiotics and the significant health issues that can come with increasing antimicrobial resistance. That was only the 5th time that the United Nations has issued a global health directive. On the Codex side, there's really 2 areas that look at the use of antibiotics on farms relative to what they mean for food safety. And I think it's important to remember that Codex is about food safety. So it's how the use of antibiotics on a farm affect the safety of the product that a consumer might eat. There's a Codex committee on residues of veterinary drugs in food. As that says, it's about the residues in food. What are the acceptable levels to assure that you're not going to have a human health incident, a human health incident due to a residue of a veterinary medicine in food. The other one that is going on right now is the Codex Ad Hoc Task Force on Antimicrobial Resistance. This is looking at the transmission of antimicrobial resistance through the food chain. So different than having a residue, this is what happens when we use antibiotics in our food-producing animals that leads to the rise of resistant bacteria that then could be transmitted through the food production system. Getting a little bit back to what are consumers thinking about in terms of antibiotic use and AMR in our food production systems. This is some social monitoring data. It's a little bit dated. It's about 18 months old. But it's looking at the online social media conversations in the U.S. around dairy. So the big pie there is all dairy conversations. And that little sliver that you can barely see there are the conversations that include antibiotic use and dairy. 0.06%. Not a very large part of at least that social media conversation about the use of antibiotics. But when it is about the use of antibiotics, it's almost overwhelmingly negative. 44% of it's negative, 50% neutral. Little sliver there, only about 6% positive. And probably most of those positive conversations are driven around internal industry social media conversations and not the general public conversations. Drilling down a little bit more into this data, not a lot of conversations, but you can see that they vary by product. There's a lot more negativity in the conversations about antibiotic use when it comes to fluid milk than something like yogurt. I think some of this is reflective of the type of marketing that occurs in these various products. I think there's been a lot more emphasis in our fluid category in the U.S. about antibiotic use, no antibiotic residues, raised without antibiotics or organic production systems than you might see in some of the other categories. I think if you were to take this data from 18 months ago and compare it to data that might be available today, I bet we see an expansion in each of those categories as there's increasing marketing in some of those other categories as well about the use of antibiotics in the production systems that result in their products. Drilling down a little bit more into that conversation in the fluid milk category, you get down there in that bottom part and the words are kind of small. There's more information in the paper on this. But it is about the use of antibiotics in general in livestock production in the U.S. 70% of antibiotics, as defined by the Food and Drug Administration in the U.S., are sold and distributed for use in food-producing animals. That number has been used in the media and by activists, rightly or wrongly, to look at whether or not that volume is leading to antimicrobial resistance in the human health settings. And what you see there is that that number is tied intrinsically to the concern about AMR developing within our livestock production systems. There are other elements that are also having influence on what antibiotic and antimicrobial use might look like on the farm. A variety of non-governmental organizations. Health for Animals is the international trade association for the pharmaceutical companies, animal pharmaceutical companies. The International Dairy Federation is essentially the international trade organization for the global dairy industry. World Veterinary Association, Consumers International from a consumer perspective. All of these organizations have their own take on what judicious and responsible use look like at the farm level and where society should be moving forward with those. The International Dairy Federation has a long-term monitoring process looking at our mastitis-causing organisms and looking at their resistance patterns to antibiotics. And their long-term monitoring is suggesting that they're not seeing any changes in resistance patterns from the use of antibiotics for the treatment, control, and prevention of mastitis. And there's things like this, Antibiotics Off the Menu campaign that was done by Consumers Union and Consumers International. They put together a scorecard for fast food and fast casual restaurants in the United States and gave them a grade of A to F based upon what they required of their sourcing systems in terms of how antibiotics are used and, more importantly, probably the restriction of the use of antibiotics. This campaign, launched in 2016, requested that these companies define a global time-bound action plan for the phase-out of routine use of antibiotics used in human medicine across all of their meat and poultry supply systems. So this campaign is asking companies like McDonald's, Taco Bell, Panera, Chipotle to have defined timelines when they would phase out the use of medically important, as defined by the World Health Organization, medically important antibiotics in the use of food production systems. Also adopting third-party auditing to ensure that they're actually meeting their benchmarks that they're stating. So you have consumers that want to know about the how and why of antibiotic use, and generally the use of antibiotics in livestock production systems having a negative connotation, with the understanding that we do need to treat sick animals, and it's appropriate to treat sick animals. We have underlying federal regulations. We have, I'll call it an overlay of international guidelines and regulations. We have then a variety of consumer and industry groups that set their own parameters as to what judicious and responsible use might look like. And that leads to customers making decisions. Each of these customers here has judicious and responsible use sourcing requirements within their systems here in the U.S. and internationally. None of these, to my knowledge, have specific statements about use specific to dairy production. Some of them are general across their livestock production systems, so any meat, poultry, or dairy that goes into their systems, they have general guidelines. Some of them get very specific. Some of the questions that are being asked by these companies on the social responsible sourcing questionnaires. Did I do that? Okay. They don't want you to know what they're asking on their social responsible sourcing questionnaires, but I can tell you. So they're asking things like, are your health plan records traceable back to the animal, and do they contain the reason for giving the drug, including the drug, the amount, the route of administration, and et cetera. If you were to go into the Food and Drug Administration's warning letters that go out to livestock producers who have a tissue residue violation, and specifically look at the dairy ones, you'll see that almost all of them talk about having a record-keeping system so inadequate that they did not know the drug, the volume, the route of administration, the length of administration, and how long they should have withheld that animal from the market. So record keeping, the human aspect. You've heard that come up in both of the previous presentations. The people part of this. Records are a people part. We had a discussion in the residue discussion committee this morning about the issues of potential residues in milk occurring from robotic milkers. It's not the robotic milkers, it's the programming into the computer system that this cow is treated so that that milk is diverted. It's a people problem. So they're asking here about a people problem. What's the average animal daily dose of antibiotics administered to dairy cows? That's an interesting one. In the U.S., ionophores are classified as antibiotics, and that's 70% of antibiotics that are sold and distributed for use in animals and in livestock and poultry production. Around 35% of that is ionophores. In other countries, ionophores are classified differently and wouldn't be included in such a number. So our average daily dose would look a lot different in dairy if we include ionophores or we don't include ionophores. Then the last one here, do you have a written policy requiring only veterinarians administer any antibiotics? That's an interesting one. Can you imagine going to a, whether it's a 5-cow Amish dairy or a 20,000 cow fairly vertically integrated dairy and saying you have to have a veterinarian give your dry cow treatment? But they're asking questions, and they're asking questions because they want to know how and why antibiotics are being used in our systems. And if we don't provide answers, provide transparency in the how and why, they then start coming out with things like this. Again, not dairy specific. This is specific to poultry production. But a Chick-fil-A, a fast food, fast casual restaurant chain here in the U.S. In partnership with our suppliers, we're working to establish a stable, sustainable supply chain that can deliver on our promise of no antibiotics ever. This means by the end of 2019, every customer at every restaurant across the country will be served chicken without antibiotics every day. That's not allowing using antibiotics when the animal is sick. That's saying no antibiotics ever. Think about that from an animal welfare perspective, if it's no antibiotics ever. Our organic production standards in the U.S. require an antibiotic to be given to an animal if it is the right course of treatment for the health and well-being of the animal. That animal is no longer organic, but it's a requirement. Here you have a whole chain saying no antibiotics ever, and their customers are meeting it, and they're not the only one that has that no antibiotics ever pledge. Essentially, the vast majority of the poultry in the U.S. will be moving towards no antibiotics ever. What does that mean for mortality and morbidity? Probably increase. One would think that those would be considered animal welfare concerns. Here they're taking the issue of antibiotic use and elevating it above animal welfare. I think it'll be interesting to see where that nets out in the end. So what are the implications for udder health? I've given a lot of information about what consumers think, what they may feel about this, some of the underlying federal and international regulations, some things that some customers are starting to do. But I think what it really means is increasing regulatory oversight, more veterinarian involvement, selective dry cow therapy. You've heard a bit about that already. You're going to hear more about that here at the meeting tomorrow. New tools and even more. Just to give you an insight into increased regulatory oversight. California has an antibiotic use law that's applicable to the use of antibiotics in livestock production. Went into effect January 1st of this year. It mimics some of the federal aspects. It bans the use of medically important antibiotics for gain or feed efficiency purposes. But another thing it did was over-the-counter is gone. Any antibiotic that is to be used on a farm, and California is our #1 dairy state in the U.S., has to have a prescription and must be ordered in some capacity through the veterinarian. That doesn't mean that they have to buy it from the veterinarian. They can still buy it from from their traditional suppliers like the route truck, internet sources, the farm and fleet store, but it's going to be different. California is also collecting additional sales and on-farm use data. That's different than what our federal level is doing right now, which is just requiring our pharmaceutical companies to report sales and distribution data. Here they're looking at on-farm use data. There are some other efforts that are looking to gather additional information about on-farm use across a variety of livestock production systems in the U.S., but here California has mandated it. Increased veterinary oversight. Within our National Dairy Farm Program, Farmers Assuring Responsible Management, which is our national dairy cattle well-being program, January 1st of last year, we required that any participant in the program had to have a VCPR signed by the veterinarian of record and the farm owner or farm manager. That's a big step. This is providing some additional veterinary oversight. I think you saw in some of the questions from what companies are asking their suppliers, they're also looking at increased veterinary oversight. I think for some of our international folks that are here, you might think about what that already looks like in some of your countries. You probably require more veterinary oversight than some places in the U.S. might today. Selective dry cow therapy, I'm not going to dwell on this. I am not an expert on this, but this is coming. There are places that are already implementing it with great success, places that have tried it with varied success, and places that have tried it and have failed spectacularly. But it's coming. Selective dry cow therapy is where we're going to be in the future. New and improved animal health tools. Animal-only antibiotics, so that we're not using medically important antibiotics. I call it real-time diagnostics to improve our decision-making on whether or not antibiotics are the right course of treatment, and if it is, what's the right antibiotic to use. Non-antibiotic interventions. We've heard a little bit about immunomodulators. There are other non-antibiotic treatments in the pipeline that are coming along. Improved vaccine efficacy. We know that there are some vaccines that work fairly well for us. Their efficacy is probably going to continue to increase over time. And I think genetic selection for mastitis resistance. We know that there's a lot of information hidden within the genetic information in our animals. Some animals are more naturally resistant to a certain bacteria. There's been some work looking at gene editing to accelerate that. That comes with its own issues about the public perception of what a gene-edited animal is, but I think it's a tool that could be in our toolbox in the future. And then finally, marketplace choice. I think this is a real reality. To my knowledge, we don't have any, call it major marketers at least, that have gone to the no antibiotics ever for conventional dairy production supplies in the U.S. yet. We have the organic side, well-defined, has other things beyond the use of restricting antibiotics that go to it. But I think we're going to come to a point in time where we're going to have conventional systems where it's no antibiotics ever. And there'll be label claims on that. And who knows what that might look like. That may be no antibiotics ever in our milking animals. Maybe no antibiotics ever from the time it was born. It all depends upon what they're willing to pay a supplier to be able to supply that. But I do think that's coming. And so I think overall, when you think about what's driving dairy farmers to get better in terms of udder health, there's a lot of market dynamics. So everything that we've heard about in terms of the 5-point plan and how that developed and why it was done, really, those were really, in the back end, marketplace demands. Reducing somatic cell count, improving the ability to, the productivity of your animals, having, I'll call it more saleable days of milk from your animals when you go back 50 or 60 years. Really, the back end of that were marketplace demands. And I think ultimately, consumers and customers, they may not be asking specific questions about udder health, but what they're asking about milk quality and the use of antibiotics on farms really is about udder health, because the udder is the place where we use the vast majority of our antibiotics. And so their questions and their concerns and their demands are, in fact, impacting udder health. And I'd be happy to take any questions if we have any time left. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jamie. I think we have time for one question, if anyone has one.
One comment. I guess as I'm listening to this, I'm concerned because when we say no antibiotics, what's an antibiotic? How do we define an antibiotic?
So the definition of an antibiotic is interesting. I already talked about how in the U.S. ionophores are an antibiotic. Particularly in Europe, they're classified as an antimicrobial, and they might not fit into that no antibiotics ever process. But in the U.S., it probably would. But there are exceptions to that. So I talked about that no antibiotics ever that's starting to be pervasive in the poultry production systems. They do use ionophores as coccidiostats. So there are certain segments in the poultry production systems that are having that no antibiotics ever, but allowing ionophores as a coccidiostat, even though it's broadly would be classified as an antibiotic here in the U.S. And then some others are not. So it depends on, it's going to be the definition that, say, a market wants to choose. And so, I could, if we were to look at what, say, the average daily dose of antibiotics to dairy cows in the U.S. looked like, if I was simply to be able to move ionophores from an antibiotic to a non-antibiotic for that purpose, we would probably reduce the volume by 90, 95, 99, more than 99%. So yeah, some of it is that definition, what is and what is not. And there's no singular global authority that's going to tell an individual market what that is. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Join me in thanking Jamie.